I want to be the painter of my country.
Tarsila was part of a small community of artists and intellectuals from Brazil who were in constant relationship with avant-garde figures in Europe. Tarsila pushed the boundaries of Brazilian modern art by ingesting and transforming sources. First from Europe and then from the culture of her own country, she made a radical statement unlike any Brazil had experienced before.
I wanted to make something really out of the ordinary. Biavaporu was that monstrous figure, the little head, the skinny little arm supported by an elbow, those enormous long legs, and next to it, a cactus that looked like a sun.
The exhibition follows Tarsila as she moves back and forth between her native Sao Paulo and Paris, and then travels throughout Brazil, exploring and discovering the poetic potential of her homeland.
I am so thankful to have spent the whole of my childhood on the fazenda. My memories of that time have grown precious to me.
In Brazil. I want to especially thank our co-organizers, the Art Institute of Chicago, and Luis's co-curator, Stephanie D'Alessandro, who began this project as the Gary and Francis Comer Curator of International Modern Art at the Art Institute of Chicago, and concluded it here in New York as a Leonard Lauder Curator of Modern Art in the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art, and curator in charge of the Leonard Lauder Research Center for Modern Art at Metropolitan Museum of Art. Stephanie, you may have the longest title of anyone I know, but welcome. We're so happy you're here with us this morning. We are, of course, also very grateful to the artist and her family in particular, and we're pleased to welcome so many members of the family here, too. Support for this project came from the International Council of the Museum of Modern Art, the Modern Women's Fund here at the museum, Vicky and Joseph Safra Foundation, as well as Clarice Oliveira Tavares, Yvonne Dado Adair, and the Consulate General of Brazil, and the Museum of Modern Art's annual exhibition fund. And not unlike Stephanie, Luis Pérez-Oramas, my dear friend, began this project as the Estrellita Brodsky Curator of Latin American Art, and has gone on to many other great things, teaching and advising around the world, breaking my heart, and he knows that, when he left the museum. I can say that I learned so much from Luis about art in general and Latin American art in particular, and I look forward to learning even more about Tarsila this morning. Welcome, Luis, and congratulations.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you all.
So that was a very beautiful introduction to Tarsila, but tell us who she is. Where did she come from? How did she get to Paris?
Well, Tarsila's upbringing is, first of all, she started her training when she was 30 years old in Sao Paulo with an academic painter in 1917. Her upbringings are from the economy plantation in Sao Paulo. She grew up in the fazenda in the countryside, and obviously she comes from the elite bourgeois elite from the Sao Paulo at a moment of flourishing economy in the 1910s and 20s. She first married someone, then she divorced, and then she met Oswald Andrade, who was a very central figure for modern art and the history of ideas in Brazil and Latin America, and they both traveled to Paris in the early 1920s, and she travels back and forth between Sao Paulo and Paris during the 1920s. She serves as like a bridge of ideas and innovations, and at the same time she starts this kind of condensation, this assimilation of her own specificity as a Brazilian artist by digesting, I would say, almost anthropophagically, the legacy of modern art in Europe. And so this is the way she achieves this incredible invention of a whole new figuration for Brazilian landscape in the 1920s. And obviously, she anticipates the iconography of anthropophagy in the late 1920s.
We'll get to anthropophagy
yes.
in a moment. But what is the transformative moment for her? When does she move from being a relatively talented academic painter to somebody who is transformative, who opens up new pathways, not just for Brazil, but for the idea of modern art in general?
I think that happened, it's a matter of discussion, Glenn, as everything in art history, but I think that happened around 1924, 1925, when she's back from Paris as a fully trained modern artist, when she's sharing with a group of intellectuals in Brazil, but also with a handful of important acquaintances in Europe, among the most important modern artists in Europe at the time. And she comes back to Brazil and she travels to the inner country of Brazil with Blaise Andrade, for example, the poet, with Mario de Andrade, also the Brazilian poet, and she rediscovers her own country. This is a moment of almost conversion for her, I think, and that is a moment when she starts producing this work of condensation of modern art and the specificity, the differential specificity of her own country. I think that is obviously 24, 25, but obviously the culmination of that moment is 28, 29 with the Manifesto Antropofágico.
Well, let's go back to, I think, 23 with the Negra, which has been a painting that has baffled me, confused me, excited me. So I'm thrilled to have it here so we can look at it carefully. What's going on there?
Well, you know, first of all, Negra is a Parisian painting. So she painted that work in Paris in 1923. There are two things there that I think are important. There are many things. It's a multi-layered work, I think. But on one hand, she places at the center of modern iconography in Brazil this subject of subordination, a black woman naked. I think that is a radical statement that gets to us with many other layers of signification. But Paris in the 20s is also one of the cultural capitals of blackness, of negritude. There are studies about that, even black culture, American black culture in Paris at that time. So it is this kind of centrality of a bather, and Stephanie D'Alessandro, my co-curator, who wrote a magnificent essay on a Negra, and particularly linking a Negra with the whole modern tradition of bathers. She is one of these great bathers of modern art, but she's a black bather, and she's a childhood memory. You will find in the exhibition this travel book that she kept with her, with a picture of a servant from the fazenda, from the country house, that is very close to the model of a Negra, probably the model of a Negra. So it is the infancy, it is motherhood, it is blackness, and this centrality of the female figure.
But isn't it also somewhat about distortion? And when I look at that figure, it's not just the distortion of her arm and her breast that sort of swoops over her arm, but it's the displacement of her lips.
Well, you know, she is, probably we can answer that question is a twofold answer, Glenn. You just heard Tarsila in the video describing Abaporu. She says it's a monstrous figure. This notion, which is a very complex notion, the monster, I am not saying that Negra is a monster, but she is dealing with the implications of modern figuration, which to a certain extent bring the idea of deformation, the idea of bringing to the extremes, bringing to the border out of normality the form of figures. I mean, like in a way to oppose to the very disciplined way an academic painter can represent the world. So, a Negra, as well as all other paintings by Tarsila at that time, are dealing with this formal problem. But I think this is my interpretation.
You're allowed to.
Thank you, Glenn. I think that what we can read, or what one can read as deformation in that painting, is a symptom of this idea of centrality and motherhood, of amplification of a figure. It's a way to this is not any black woman. This is a way to stress the very monumentality of this differential figure. This is a differential subject, and it gets suddenly to this central awareness of that society and of that elite at that moment. And then, as I say, she's the mother of all of us.
So let's fast forward 5 years to and I can never get it out.
Anthropophagia, yeah.
Anthropophagia, where this figure returns in a way, doesn't
Absolutely.
she? But in a very different form.
Yeah, it's a fascinating. There is a location. There's a specific location in the first gallery of the exhibition. On the right of the gallery, you can see the three anchoring paintings: A Negra, then A Negra plus a Vaporú is Anthropophagia. So it takes a decade of transformation, of figural transformation, of thinking, of compositional process, and she founds the process with A Negra. Then she creates a Vaporú which anticipates the anthropophagic manifesto, and then suddenly Oswald de Andrade and Bob are in awe about that figure. This is what we are looking for. And then she concludes in grandeur, in grande manière, with Anthropophagia, which is the combination of the two figures. So I would say, as all these great masterworks that are matter of condensation, you have there the whole tradition of Veders, as Stephanie has so beautifully stressed in her essay. You have there a new form of representation of nature and human bodies. You have there the porosity between, the human and the notion of human, notion of nature. And then you have there an absolutely striking statement about this message of corporeal renewal of culture by corporeally embodying otherness in oneself. I mean, the idea that culture renovates itself by assimilating the other, but assimilating the other in its wholeness, in his wholeness, in her wholeness, in bodily assimilating the other.
So not cannibalization, but really ingestion.
Ingestion.
But isn't there also a transformation from blackness to something else, right? So A Negra is a manifestly black woman.
Mm-hmm.
But in Anthropophagia, she's become something else. Her blackness has given way to certainly a very different tonality.
She becomes Creole.
Yeah, and so what's happening there?
Well, it happens something formal. Obviously, there are formal decisions in that painting, and then we know who she is. She is a black woman, and then who know that this blackness is meant to engendrate otherness and others, no matter the color. So I think that I wouldn't go up to suggest a racial reading of Anthropophagia. There is obviously race as an issue in A Negra because it's a black subject. But Anthropophagia is a different thing. I think is human flesh against the flesh of nature, and human flesh in its universality. And I would say that it is, as to quote Grimson, the great Martinique poet, is creolization. Is the birth of métissage.
But isn't creolization a kind of ingestion of race?
It is ingestion of race.
I'm pushing because...
No, it is definitely ingestion of race. It is not only ingestion of race, it's ingestion of the wholeness of the... I mean, I think it's something that A Negra inscribes clearly, is that, Tarsila gets to understand that the depth of her own country's culture is not stigmatized by the division between body and mind. That because among other contributions, the African-Brazilian contribution, that is a culture that understands humanity in its wholeness, that does not make that division, that schizophrenic division between mind and body. And the central message of the cannibalistic manifesto is that, okay, culture is not only a matter of mind, it is a matter of body. It is an appeal to bodies, to the human body, to the body of nature, to the corporeal existence of the world and us. And I think the greatest statement of that is that painting titled Anthropophagia.
So let's expand our conversation to include some of her landscapes and the cartoon-like figures that appear. That if a Negra and other paintings are deadly serious in their attempt to digest and create a kind of reading of Brazilian culture, her landscapes seem far more playful, far more humorous. What's happening there?
Well, I would say some of them. So some are almost sublime in their, like the lac, for example, and others. But you're right that there is a moment when she's compositionally playing with this ambiguity between anthropomorphic figures and the representational forms of nature. And then it colludes and it gets like, again, synthesized in those paintings. There is humor in some of those paintings, notably the one you refer, which is the only one, as much as we can know from Tarsila's own testimony. The street, the little figures, these kind of cartoonish figures, red boots, walking in this kind of diagonal street at the end of the exhibition here, that she is the only painting that she mentioned as she woke up. She had this dream, and she just painted that dream. So it is a dream. But then you have O Sonho, which means the dream, where a coconut tree is juxtaposed to this kind of organic form of aqueduct or structure that echoes up to the infinite. No, I think that some of the revelatory forms for her landscapes are in the drawings. And the drawings are of a almost minimalistic simplicity, almost like haiku of landscapes, haiku of figures. And she brings that and embodies them with this incredibly slow compositional intelligence and palette. And sometimes it gets to an schematic quality, I would say. And sometimes, like in the street and others, with this kind of almost cartoonish appearance. Which, by the way, I think it's a very contemporary aspect of the work. I mean, some of these paintings, which were painted in 1927, 28, they look like, Japanese figuration from the 1990s.
Well, a kuka, for instance, has that quality that you could
Absolutely.
see today, right? That's what I meant by cartoon. Like they're kind of imagined figures that have but they seem to have a playfulness to them. Is that an inappropriate reading?
No, I think there is playfulness in all these. I like to think, and this is kind of an anachronic bridge, that I love these things, and simply no one else understands what I am trying to say. But think of Oiticica. Think of the role of carnival in Oiticica and how that aspect, the feast, the party, the playfulness of the crowd has transformed in Oiticica's the legacy of late modern art. Well, the seed of that is in Tarsila. You have there Carnaval in Madureira, and we have these guys. Okay, well, she lived in Paris. She put the Eiffel Tower there. Actually, the Carnaval in Madureira in 1924 had an Eiffel Tower built in the favela, and she painted that. I mean, this legacy of the festive dimension of human culture is fundamental. And it's such a serious issue that sometimes, serious art historians repress. It goes from, Renaissance to today, and it is this festivity what brings art to life. That's our friend Avi Barbour who put it that way.
You mentioned The Dream, which is one of the most haunting pictures, in which I look at that and I read it very much almost as a surrealist meditation. And tell us about her circle in Paris. Who was she talking to? Who did she study with? What were the issues she was grappling with?
Well, she, as you know, she studied with Glaise, Lot, and Leger. This is a beautiful anecdote that Lygia Clark tells that when she arrives to Leger, Studio Leger, oh, what about that young girl, Tarsila, that was here in the 1920s? No, this is the two great women artists from the 20th century. Brazil, the one who founded the process and the one who closed the history, were both at some point in Paris with Leger. But then a whole bunch of acquaintances that are so significant, you know, from Éric Satie and Darius Milhaud. Darius Milhaud, who had been the secretary of Paul Claudel when Paul Claudel was the ambassador of France in Rio de Janeiro. That gives you the sense of what kind of people she would have met both in Rio and Paris. Then Brancusi, who, for example, we have this beautiful drawing by Brancusi dedicated to Oswald and Tarsila, stating that the kiss by Brancusi is Oswald and Tarsila kissing themselves. Then Blaise Cendrars, so I would say that our Trans-Siberian is Feuille de Route, which is the poetry book written by Blaise Cendrars and illustrated by Tarsila about the trip to the inner country of Brazil. It's a bunch. I mean, she visited the studios of Picasso. She was really at the center of avant-garde culture in Paris in the 1920s. And she was at the center of the avant-garde culture in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro in the 1920s. So it is a combination of those things that makes possible Tarsila to become this hugely symbolic bridge between European modernity and Brazilian modernity.
We could go on forever. I always feel like I'm in the midst of a seminar when I have the pleasure of talking with Luis, but I want to make sure that all of you have an opportunity to ask Luis any questions that you might have. So if you do have a question, please raise your hand and let us know.
Brazilians are not that shy. Huh?
They're just waiting.
Oh, thank you, Eduardo. That's well, you know, because this show is here because it's my very good friend Stephanie D'Alessandro. In 2010, I was invited to talk on Lygia Clark to the Art Institute of Chicago. And so I went there because we were starting the organization of the Lygia Clark retrospective here with Connie Butler. And at the end of that lecture, Stephanie came to me and said, Luis, would you like to do a Tarsila show with me? If you go, I go. I said, let's do it. I was kind of lying to Stephanie. Lying, no. I just had gotten a call from Sao Paulo inviting me to curate the Sao Paulo Biennial, so I knew that everything would happen later on. But that day...
Is that belatedness?
That is a good belatedness. And I am, thank you. Well, but that day I knew that Tarsila could happen. But I have to say that Tarsila was in our conversation since years probably before that. I remember one day we were together with Kathy Halbreich in front of Tarsila's work at the Museum of Modern Art in Rio de Janeiro, and we were like, you know, discussing the issue and thinking, what does that mean to bring Tarsila to MoMA? How could that happen? How could we do that happen? So in a long term, Eduardo, we might have begun to think of this in 2008, 2009. 2010 was a critical moment when Stephanie invited me to be on board of her project. And then I had to do the Sao Paulo Biennial in 2012, the Lygia Clark and the Torres Garcia show here. And then
he sounds overworked, doesn't he? I want to come back to this issue because you reminded me of that conversation we had, struggling to understand where to place her. Now, part of that, of course, is the schemas of interpretation that one has coming from a European culture, coming from the Museum of Modern Art, trying to locate an artist within the framework that we've created here. And clearly Tarsila resists that. She offers a different idea. But we did struggle, and we talked about issues of anachronism and belatedness. How do we reconcile those very problematic Eurocentric ideas about other modernisms with the very progressive notion that Tarsila herself endeavors to articulate? Where's the juncture? Is there a juncture?
There are many junctions, I think, not only one junction, Glenn, but to go back to that moment, if you recall it, is so beautiful, because we were looking at a Tarsila, one of those Tarsilas, you know, that are particularly folky. Those Tarsilas where she is really assimilating folk art, where she is really assimilating the vernacularity of Brazilian culture. And by that Tarsila, we were looking at the Lazar Segal, typically beautiful expressionist like Lazar Segal. And I remember we were saying, okay, we wouldn't have that much of a struggle with Segal, but how do we do with this? And, you know, I think at some point, and we have discussed this so many times, and that's one of the reasons I miss also MoMA, is to all those discussions, is that, you know, we know that at some point our canon has a limit, that our canons have to give up to a difference, give up to an openness. And I think that is the junction. The junction is that, okay, what we thought were the limits of understanding of modern art has to be amplified. And that is a great legacy of great artists, to amplify the limits of our understanding of art, to amplify the dimensions of that space that we call or we identify, in this case, as modern art. You know, I was rereading Mario de Andrade, the great poet, who wrote in 1927 that Tarsila was radically addressing bad taste, and that she knew that she knew she was blending modern art with what the bourgeoisie in Brazil would consider despicable and bad taste. And I think that puts her in a very radical contemporary place today.
Precisely. Other question? Yeah, finally. Great. We're going to start from the edge and move to the center.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for this show. It's so exciting to see Tarsila at the MoMA, and the fact that you got Abaporu from Argentina is a major achievement.
Thanks to Eduardo.
Eduardo Cosini, please, Eduardo, wave your hand so we can all thank you.
I'd just like to hear you speak a little bit more about the other regional and folk influences on Tarsila's work, and also the indigenous influence, so the use of Tupi words and
Well, the Tupi words, you know, this is the anecdote of Raul Bob looking at the dictionary with Oswald by looking at the painting that Tarsila has brought as a birthday gift to Oswald, which is Abaporu, and they found Tupi words for Abaporu, which is the human who actually digests humans. But you know, there was, listen, this idea, it's a very complex and long-lasting process in a way. All artists have to deal with their locality, with their vernacularity. I mean, all of them, from you know, the Night of Time to Jackson Pollock to Tarsila do Amaral. All of them have to face the challenge of blending what they think is universal with what they feel is particularly significant as differential in their locality. That's not an exclusive element in Tarsila's work. It is present in all the artists. Tarsila went on a absolutely radical rediscovery of Brasilianidade, and the specificity of Brazil culture, including folk and indigenous culture. But think of cannibalism. I mean, one of the foundations of modern humanism is that essay by Michel de Montaigne titled The Cannibals, which actually deals with a group of cannibals brought in the 16th century to the court of France. You know, it is about otherness. The universality of that quest is about the other. It's about the disponibility, the radical disponibility towards that otherness, which is actually present in this work. And I like the idea that this exhibition ends with this representation of a crowd, this kind of frontal faces looking at us and looking at her production from the 1920s. Stephanie and myself, we were for months struggling. Are we going to end with this or not? And so it was one day was so clear. She called me. Said, we should end with this, and I said, I agree with you. I just came to the same conclusion. And you know, is the social body is us who are they expecting to renovate that legacy, and it's us in front of the other. And so I wouldn't get to the anthropological dimension of that vernacularity, of that folky aspect. It is a more telling message. It's about, you know, otherness and the other, and I think that is what fits this work and what makes this work so relevant today.
There was a question just on the edge there. Thank you.
The exposition ends with 1933. She lives another nearly 40 years. What happened?
Well, it happened what happened with all artists. She continued to paint, she continued to produce, she continued to be at the center of discussions and intellectual exchanges. She wrote. She had a great critical production as a writer on cultural matters and art matters. Araceli Amaral, who we are indebted to her incredible research on Tarsila, also published her critical writings. But I would say that she got to her manière, she got to her signature style in the 1920s, and she continued to develop that, but she kept to that form that she had invented in the 1920s. So this is the peak of the production, and she continued, you know, to produce her work, as you mentioned, up to very late. And in the 1960s, then she was the object of a whole rediscovery by a whole different generation of artists and intellectuals, and she became even more central for Brazilian culture than she was in 1920s and more 1930s.
Other questions?
I would say the same, ask the same question, but talking about Oswald de Andrade, because this more or less the same time when she and Oswald would split. And of course, you point out that Abapuru is before the manifest, but sometime he goes out and her talent finish.
Luis Antonio, but I didn't get what is it?
What was her relation with Oswald de Andrade? Because I think it was very important for this period.
Yes.
When he got out,
he
changed her power.
Yeah.
She's not the same artist anymore.
No, definitely. That's a.
I'm not saying that she's an illustrator, but.
No, that's a very important question. I think, you know, sometimes, I mean, I remember once I read a Gerard Richter interview, and Richter saying the most important thing for an artist, after being truthful to his or her past, is to have an interlocution, a significant interlocution, and to have interlocutors. And she was lucky to be at the center of a series of interlocutions with Mario de Andrade, but especially with Oswald de Andrade during the 1920s. It is not, the interlocution is that dialogic exchange. I think she influenced Oswald as much as Oswald influenced her. I mean, Abapuru precedes the Manifesto Antropofágico. It's this image that goes before, that does not speak, but goes before than the words, and suddenly make possible the words. But then, you know, as you said, in 1930, their marriage is over. She went on her life. She became, for a very short period of time, an activist, a social activist, and then she married Luis Martins, who was also an important influence on both of them as an art critique and as a journalist. So I think I would say that the work in itself has this dialogic dimension. It is calling, it is producing interpellation of the social body in Brazil in the 1920s. Probably Brazilian society was not ready for that message. You have the workers, you have the crowd expecting and waiting for that message to be embodied by other generations. And that is also interlocution. the way we act in front of this work, the way this work influenced us, and we influence the reception of this work. I would say that that was the relationship with Oswald. Obviously, Oswald is a monumental figure, a monumental intellectual, a more rational, probably, an analytical mind than Tarsila was. But without the intuition of Tarsila, without the premonition of figures that Tarsila brought, Oswald would have been different too, and less probably.
And you had a question. Where's this microphone coming?
Thank you, Luis and Stephanie, for this gift of a show for New York City, first of all. And then I was interested, if I understood your remark correctly, I think you said that Tarsila painted in a way deliberately in bad taste. Am I right? That would have been recognized by the Brazilian bourgeoisie as such. And so my follow-up question to that was simply, during her lifetime, who were her collectors, who were her patrons, who were that part of the dialogic equation?
Well, almost no collectors during her lifetime. You know, we know by people who were suddenly interested in Tarsila's work in the 1960s, they visited Tarsila, and all these famous works were there underneath the bed, and so she kept those works. Obviously, there were exchanges in the 1920s, and Mario de Andrade was one of the collectors of Tarsila since very early on, and Blaise Andrade was also, if we can say, a collector with all these drawings, and Oswald was also, you know, a collector of Tarsila, but probably a body of collectors seeking the work in the 20s and even less in the 30s. No, very little.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So, last question. If not, can we thank Luis, Stephanie, for a fantastic exhibition?
Stephanie. Thank you, Glenn.
The show is magnificent. How long are you in town for?